Hello and welcome to the In Publishing podcast, bringing you weekly insights into the newspaper and magazine publishing sector. I'm Ciar Byrne, and this week my guest is Sam Kinchin-Smith, Head of Special Projects at the London Review of Books. We would like to thank our podcast sponsor, Acorn Web Offset, the Yorkshire-based specialist A5 and A4 magazine printer. With high-speed web offset and sheet-fed printing, together with in-house saddle stitching, perfect binding and mailing services, Acorn can cope with the most demanding of production turnarounds. Acorn prides itself on its efficiency and low-cost print production. For more information, visit acornweb.co.uk. Sam Kinchin-Smith is the Head of Special Projects at the London Review of Books, and before that he was digital editor of the magazine. He's also an author himself, whose projects include a history of the LRB and a monograph on Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes. Sam, welcome to the In Publishing podcast.
Thanks, Ciar.
Can you begin by telling us a bit about your career before joining the LRB?
Yeah, sure. I sort of always wanted to be a journalist and did a long internship at the New Statesman while I was doing my master's at university, but then found it quite difficult to break in, I guess, as lots of people do. And so I instead went into kind of different kinds of editorial jobs. For quite a long time, I worked in academic publishing first as an editorial assistant on Routledge's theatre and performance list, and then as a digital project manager there. And then I took a job at English Heritage, which was working on a big website project that sought to describe the entire history of England in about 200 web pages. So that was a kind of big web publishing project. And I guess I sort of accidentally became interested and got some expertise digitally in the way that I think lots of people of my generation, I'm 32, did, because of the way that the industry was going at that point in time. And so I sort of combined these sort of slightly unusual editorial jobs with a kind of growing degree of digital expertise and a kind of parallel career as a freelance culture and travel writer. And then I went fully freelance for a bit, and then I guess I was very lucky in that the magazine that I had sort of subscribed to for longest just happened to be looking for precisely the kind of editor that I'd managed to make myself, as I say, somewhat by accident. So the LRB was seeking a digital editor for the first time, and it was a magazine that I'd been reading and subscribing to for many years. And so I was very lucky to sort of enter the career that I'd always wanted to, but just at a slightly later stage through this slightly roundabout route. But I guess it's sort of both a coincidence and not that those kind of poles came together.
So you joined the LRB as digital editor, and more recently you've moved over to special projects. But if I can just talk about your digital editor role to begin with. You've described the London Review of Books as quite undigital. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's hard to imagine the LRB not remaining a print-first organisation, even if things had gone the way that people thought they might have done sort of 10 years ago. The central proposition of the LRB has always been, and one imagines will always be, a print magazine containing long articles of a kind that really are nicer to read in print. And so when you have a kind of central entity in an organization, the main thing the publication is print first. It means that the way that digital works in that organization is a bit different to how digital transformation in other magazines, particularly in the noughties, went, and newspapers similarly. The centrality of the kind of print newspaper is very different to how we think about things. And so I guess there's sort of two ways to answer the question of how one can be a successful digital editor in a magazine that that has a print emphasis. One is to be extremely sort of sensitive to that and ensure that that everything that the magazine does digitally cleaves as closely as possible to the kind of emphases and the principles of the print publication. And so that can be both in terms of design, but also in terms of the general kind of ambition and classiness of the publication. There's also the question of just getting a sample of the magazine in front of as many potential readers as possible. And obviously that's the thing that digital is uniquely able to do. And so we have, an email newsletter list of 200,000. We have 300,000 Twitter followers and 350,000 Facebook followers, and actually I think 500,000 Facebook followers, and a growing Instagram presence. And so through digital, you basically take something that your print publication does that is most suitable for that digital audience, and you use digital to provide a kind of sample of the publication that then might mean that they decide to subscribe because they come at it through the kind of platform that they're most comfortable with. Having said that, there is a sizable online readership for long form articles, and we very much encourage that. And so it's also about delivering the best possible reading and consuming experience for digital readers. But then the other thing is that the LRB is sort of more than just a publication. It's, we have a bookshop and a cafe,
yeah.
But we also, have events programs, we have a podcast, we have videos, like a lot of publications in that respect. And so obviously having a print magazine at the center doesn't mean that you can do lots of interesting things in digital, kind of orbiting that kind of central magazine.
Right. And you've already touched on this, but when you came in as the first digital editor, you wanted to reinvigorate the LRB's digital offering. How did you set about doing that?
I mean, I think the danger of reinvigorate suggests that you want to sort of dramatically change things, whereas actually, I think the thing that the LRB is, and the reason why people value it so much, is because everything in it tries to be, and often succeeds in being, sort of the very best in terms of the writing, the editing, the typography, the design in a certain kind of a way. And so what I was interested in is whether you could sort of take that level of precision and ambition and apply it to all of the different kind of ways that one does digital. So you reinvigorate newsletters first, say, and then you find a way of doing Instagram, which for a publication that is very unillustrated, presented certain challenges. And then you find a way of, say, live streaming events and doing as good a job with that as the bookshop events program had already been doing. And then you you sort of build a sort of strong platform of doing things well, and then from that you can build on that with slightly more original ideas.
So you touched on social, and I wondered how important it is to you as a publisher, and in particular you mentioned Instagram and how you have managed to use Instagram as a publication which is not image heavy.
Yeah, so when I started at the LRB, I focused quite heavily on digital because essentially it was a kind of low-hanging fruit. It was the period where, for example, if you posted 10 times a day on Facebook, you could get hundreds of clicks from each one of those posts. And so it was an area of kind of easy innovation and best practice that would produce immediate results in terms of increasing the traffic that we were getting from these platforms that we'd managed to accrue a kind of large audience on before I'd started, but that we hadn't gone about systematically figuring out the best way of publishing on them. But then about a year and a half into my time at the LRB, as happened to a lot of publications and organizations, the Facebook algorithm changed, and I think to a lesser extent the Twitter algorithm changed. And so the extent to which these platforms produced a sort of huge amount of traffic for publications with very little effort changed quite significantly. And we, fortunately, we were less invested in these kind of platforms than other publishers, and so it wasn't like it became an existential threat. But it did mean that we had to kind of take a step back from the sort of approach to social that was just like, the more you put into it, the more you get out, and actually start thinking about what the best things that we could use these platforms for were. And a sort of a couple of examples of that. One would be that we became interested in using Facebook Live, as a lot of publications did. This is something we do a bit less of now, but it was a very good way of kind of getting into the event live streaming game, which obviously has become hugely significant in the kind of pandemic period, at quite an early stage, without having too much kind of investment in technology being required. But also, as you say, a platform like Instagram, which I started our Instagram channel, it poses a really interesting question of a very word-based, unillustrated publication, which is like, how do you present the LRB in a form that is appealing to an Instagram audience, and ultimately use it to find a new readership. This is something that other publications had figured out how to do, and that to some extent we copied them, but we put our own spin on it, which was to actually do word posts. So you present, for example, a short pull quote, a single sentence, a couple of sentences that successfully convey the sort of spirit and tone of an article, and you just post that in a kind of elegant way, as a sort of provocation. You can also post sort of whole poems, which is something another publication called the Paris Review does very nicely. And in doing that, we found certain principles of how you can convey the kind of emphasis and tone of an article quickly, that we could then apply to other things that we did online. So I think by having a very platform-specific sort of investigative and exploratory process, you end up having lots of ideas for how the central thing that you do can be kind of communicated and repackaged in different and interesting ways.
Right. And at the end of last year, your new website went live. Why did that website need relaunching? And what were your guiding principles in the relaunch?
Well, it needed relaunching, although inevitably many of our readers thought it didn't need relaunching, and made that clear when we relaunched it. But I think that happens to every publication and other organization that creates a new website.
Yes.
It was 10 years old, and it looked it. And it was built on, I wouldn't say sand, but it wasn't built on a particularly robust back-end kind of platform. The CMS situation was not good at all. And so there was a significant kind of front-end refresh and a significant bit of back-end sort of rebuilding for the next 10 years that needed to be done. I guess the principles behind it, editorially speaking, were quite simple, as a lot of what the LRB does is. Essentially, it's about presenting articles as elegantly as possible to cleave, as I said before, as closely as possible to the print reading experience online, and to sort of actively incentivize people to keep reading online. And then it's about repackaging the sort of existing issues and archive pieces in such a way that it draws people into those two. I mean, the amazing thing about working with the LRB, and I think we'll probably return to this, is that perhaps uniquely as a publication, almost every article in its archive is almost as interesting and valuable 10 years after publication as it is when it's published. And so the question of how you present a kind of parallel digital publication that's formed of both what's in the present issue, but it's also in the archive, is a constant curatorial and editorial challenge. And so a big driver of how we kind of put together the website was in encouraging that use of it. One example of that would be that we sort of put together a very elegant collections format, so that you can basically make the single most dominant thing on the homepage a collection of articles that aren't just the articles that have been most recently published. The other thing is to bring in these sort of other things that the LRB does, and sort of present a way of moving between them more fluidly, and creating connections between them. So that could be both our own podcast and the podcast that we partner with, Talking Politics. That can be the video program and also the event live streaming program, information about the bookshop and the cafe. And then, we launched a store to sell our own books and merchandise. And so it became about creating a kind of hub for the wider LRB, as well as just a digital reading experience for the London Review of Books.
Yes, well, I was going to ask you, you work across different departments. You cross editorial, marketing and tech. How important is that cross-departmental innovation?
Really important, absolutely essential. And I think that that sort of is the story of how digital has changed publications, potentially even more than the actual sort of ways in which publishing has changed. In terms of people reading online or whatever. I think that a lot of publications appointed a digital editor or other digital people, thinking that what they needed was someone to just transform what they did for a kind of new, completely different audience, and ultimately transform the publication in ways that would secure its future. Whereas actually, I think a thing that digital has to do, because of the way that it sort of moves between these departments, is create more of a culture of prioritization, innovation, and sort of figuring out how these things combine in a way that publications often haven't asked of themselves. And so, putting together a website is about boiling an organization down to its kind of key priorities and emphases. And that's sort of true of everything that you do digitally. So I guess that was sort of how my role expanded. It was that in moving between these departments for digital ends, because of the fact that, for example, you want to create a editorial product that drives subscriptions, to take one very simple example, it also pointed to other ways that the LRB, and I imagine other publications too, needed to sort of talk interdepartmentally to figure out ways that they could do things better.
Well, we'll come on to that, but just sticking for a moment with the website. In April, it saw its highest traffic since December 2015. I'm not sure what was happening in December 2015.
I can tell you if you like.
Some very, but in a minute. And your subscriptions rose by 70% year on year. Is the London Review of Books the perfect publication for these pandemic times?
Well, we'd like to think so. I mean, I think that there's a few things that have made this a time that lots of people have become interested in reading the LRB. Obviously, people have longer to read, and so they have longer to read longer articles. And I think the other key kind of dimension is that the LRB, because of the way that it's kind of been constructed as a publication from the outset, since the very first issues in 1979, it's been based upon offering book reviews alongside kind of political and cultural comment. And so the LRB has always been set up to publish pieces about, epidemiology or global economics in a way that goes beyond what you'd expect for a kind of literary publication. But the other thing is that the LRB has a huge resource of very, very immersive articles that aren't about what's happening right now. And certainly this is something that we've lent into quite a lot. And I know other publications have too, which is sort of finding publishing that can basically offer a kind of anti-pandemic experience, and giving people that every day if that's what they want. And so the fact that we're able to sort of offer that alongside trying to publish, the article by Adam Tooze about the economics of the crisis, or the article by Rupert Beale about the science, we could also find short stories and investigative pieces and literary pieces from every decade of our publication that we could sort of distract people with, and people seem to have really found distraction in that. I mean, it's been the last 3 months have all been highest traffic since December 2015. The particular thing that happened in December.
What happened then?
It was we published some articles by the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh that resulted in traffic spikes of a kind that the publication had never seen before. So actually, we're talking about kind of the best steady traffic really ever, perhaps, for the LRB website, and it's just those kind of exceptions that mean that it hasn't actually been fully record breaking.
And as you mentioned, one of your recent projects was Diverted Traffic, which was a COVID-free newsletter. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That I mean, I think the thing to think about that as is a really, really simple idea that it turns out works very well, which is that, I mean, it's just one article a day that's sent in a newsletter, and the article is depaywalled for 24 hours. But a lot of my work goes into choosing the right sorts of articles, both in terms of a kind of spread of genres and generations of LRB publishing and writers, and only each writer can only have one entry in the series. So I think we're up to 73 or something now, and beginning to run out of the obvious writers, but obviously not writers full stop. But the thing that has been really conspicuous is that lots of people have sent an email being like, this is exactly what I want the LRB to be. I want it to deliver one article to me per day that I can read kind of almost regardless of whether I have a subscription or not. A lot of people have been most grateful for it have been subscribers and haven't considered not subscribing because these articles are depaywalled. Right. And so it's a way of packaging kind of content that turns out to be extremely attractive, much more attractive actually than say sending people 6 articles from the archive. And obviously finding something, I read all of these articles before we send them and really make sure that they have no reference to quarantine or plague or right. kind of mass death. And it's and so it turns out that in certain moments you can sort of really double down on responding to that moment in a kind of unusual and surprising way.
And has that worked at all in terms of acting as a taster for people to take up a subscription and come behind your paywall?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of hard to talk about this because obviously it's a kind of catastrophe of appalling proportions, and so to say that the pandemic and COVID has been good for the LRB is sort of a peculiar thing to say, but
sure.
But
yeah.
The fact is that we've had 4 years of subscriber growth in 3 months, and right. we've had the best traffic figures we've maybe ever had, and so a publication has to respond to and lean into the ways that people seem to be reading it, and this does seem to be a moment, just as Brexit and Trump were for the New York Times and the New Yorker say. It seems to be a moment when we need to keep doing what we're doing because it's working. Whether people are reading diverted traffic pieces and then ultimately subscribing, it's sort of I'm slightly suspicious of thinking about ideas in that way, thinking about ideas as things that immediately result in someone subscribing. I think it's better to think of a kind of suite of activities that seem to be resulting in a level of growth that we've sort of never seen before.
Okay, can I move on to asking about the US, which I think is a growth market for the London Review of Books. And last year you held a multidisciplinary event series in New York called Against the Grain. Can you tell us a bit more about that and what you see as the growth potential in the US?
Yeah, well, I mean, the growth potential in the US is huge because it's an absolutely massive English-speaking country. So, I mean, it's... the equivalent magazines to the LRB in the US, the New York Review of Books, Harper's, Paris Review, etc. They have, well, certainly the first two have more subscribers than we do, and are able to find almost that entire subscriber base just in, say, the East Coast. And so if you're a publication looking to expand from being a sort of small magazine to being a sort of big cultural player, then finding a large audience in the US is something that you have to do, and we have found that, and the US is getting on now for half of our subscriber base. But the thing is that we're a kind of cult proposition in the US. I've spent a lot of time over there interviewing subscribers, just kind of trying to get a hold of why they subscribe to the LRB as opposed to an American publication, and it's a sort of combination of Anglophilia. And also a sense that, it's a kind of double snobbery. You don't just subscribe to the New York Review of Books, you subscribe to the London Review of Books because it sort of has additional cachet. It'd be like someone trumping an English reader of the London Review of Books by saying actually they read the New York Review of Books. I think it probably goes both ways. And so what the events program and other activities is about is basically about working with large US institutions. We did events at New York Public Library. We done this series Against the Grain at a music venue called National Sawdust. It's about basically working with those publications to amplify our brand through really interesting collaborations in order to basically underpin that kind of cult presence into something that becomes more of a kind of comparative player. We also have, many writers from the US and articles about the US, so it's also just about emphasizing that to people.
Right. I think it was last November that the LRB celebrated its 40th anniversary with a series of events, which was underpinned by your digital offering. And off the back of that, you became head of special projects. Can you tell us a bit more about that, how that arose and what it means? Are you the first head of special projects?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the way to think about the anniversary was it was a sort of range of different things. We published this book with Faber. We had this series of events. We relaunched our website. It was an opportunity to, I suppose, pull together everything that had been happening around the publication into a really kind of exciting multidisciplinary celebration. And for example, we had an event with our partner podcast Talking Politics. We brought Against the Grain over to the South Bank Centre and had its kind of UK debut here. We had an event to launch the Faber book, and we published all of these events as podcasts, and then launched a website that was a way to navigate between these different areas of kind of publishing activity better than ever before. But essentially, this had sort of all come together through a certain amount of improvisation and quite kind of specific focus on different things, and then it's you sort of look around and you're like, oh my god, we've accidentally become a kind of podcast publisher and a book publisher and an events producer and a kind of cultural producer of cultural partnerships and collaborations. And so the Special Projects Department, which hadn't existed before, is an attempt by the organisation and by me within the organisation to create the kind of team and systems that mean that this work isn't just a kind of flurry of chaotic improvisation in advance of a big birthday party. It's a sustainable and coherent and kind of targeted set of activities based upon the LRB existing as an institution as well as a publication.
Right. And one of the innovations which you've introduced recently is linked to your bookshop. It's these curated book boxes, which are themed around topics such as food, sex, gardening, witches, and most recently, I think, London. Can you tell us a bit more about those?
That's actually, there's a couple of projects there. One is the book boxes, which is a project that I haven't really been so much involved in. It's very much come out of our sort of marketing teams and the bookshop, but that's very much, I mean, the emphasis on that has been that it's obviously it's something that we started doing that people seem to like, and then it became something that people really liked during a time that they were stuck at home, because they could basically join this kind of book club that would mean that they could be sent either a monthly book or books around a particular area at a time that they could read more than ever. The food, sex and witches thing is these are books of anthologies of pieces that I've been working on,
right?
The LRB
Okay.
collection series. And I guess the thing I'd say about that is that it's a very the way that I sort of found that you can take what essentially, to most people's eyes would seem to be just old stuff that isn't of very much interest. But then if you can gather these kind of pieces together around what seems like a kind of provocative, overarching topic, those I think are pretty much the three best-selling ones. I think food just about outstrips sex, which is interesting. But it means that you just take 10 articles and publish them in a kind of beautiful little book. And suddenly there's a kind of new appetite for both reading them individually and also seeing the way that these ideas have sort of developed and the kind of debate around them has changed over 40 years.
And was I know that you recently published with Fourth Estate Mantel Pieces, which was a book showcasing the best of Hilary Mantel's writing for the LRB over the years. Was that part of the same project?
Part of the same spirit. So Mantel Pieces comes out on the 1st of October, and
right.
That is that's a kind of slightly different strand, which is about collecting the work of particular writers, as opposed to work by writers around a particular theme. Obviously, we're very proud to have published Hilary Mantel's writing since the late 80s, and Hilary Mantel's writing for the LRBs since the late 80s has been extraordinary. And so that is a particularly exciting kind of collection of pieces by a particular author that we're working with another publisher on, and that sort of has the potential to be a kind of different scale because of the huge following that Hilary Mantel has, and interest in the fact that she was writing pieces for us about sort of Madonna and John Osborne and the Salman Rushdie affair in the late 80s and early 90s. The other really exciting thing about that project is that it sort of builds on some work that I was doing for the history of the LRB, which is using the archive, not the archive of pieces, but the archive of kind of letters, correspondence, files and manuscripts pertaining to previous issues that we store at the Harry Ransom Center in Texas. Right. And so sort of in counterpoint to the 20 pieces of Hilary's that we're publishing, we're also publishing for the first time letters between mainly Mary Kay Wilmers, the editor of the LRB, and Hilary, about her pieces, about life, about novels and how they interact with the pieces, which is a kind of amazing insight into what this body of work, how it was made and why it's interesting and important. And so it's a sort of, it seems to me that another way into thinking about the history of magazines is actually seeing, for example, how a piece is edited and why a piece was commissioned. And obviously through Hilary Mantel is a way of showing to people quite how interesting that is.
Oh, it sounds fascinating. I would love to read that. And from that, are there lessons that you can pass on to other publishers about how to monetize your archive? Yeah,
I mean, as I say, I think the LRB is in quite a unique position because of the fact that it tries not to be too reactive, and it works very hard on editing pieces until they're the very best version of themselves. And so the kind of evergreen quality of its archive is if not unique, then quite rare. But there will certainly be kind of content of enormous value in every publication's archive. And it's just about, I think, maybe somebody new to the organization as I was, going into it, being given the time to go into it, and then, finding the fact that there are really, really interesting pieces about witches that have been written at various points in the history of the publication, and there happens to be a moment that people seem to be interested in witches, and so perhaps you can gather this. I mean, newspapers do this by showing front pages from important historical moments, and have found ways of kind of reflecting history at different times. But I do think that every publication has the opportunity to be a kind of archive publication in parallel to constantly churning out new material, and that there is huge opportunity to find and generate value there that people aren't working on nearly hard enough.
Great. In this September, you're running a 12-hour live stream digital festival. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
We're sort of the partner on that, and
okay.
It's a partnership with the brilliant cultural producers Artangel, called the Long Player Assembly.
Okay.
But basically, it's a sort of 12-hour conversational relay in which one very interesting person speaks to someone for half an hour, and then they speak to someone else, and then they speak to someone else, and then the last person speaks to the first person for half an hour. So it's kind of uninterrupted 12-hour conversation between what we and Artangel consider to be 24 of the most kind of interesting thinkers and writers and intellectuals and artists in the world at the moment. The thing that really appealed to me about it is, and when they approached us about working with us, that to me made it seem like something we should definitely do, is that I think length is really interesting, and I think that the fact that we're a publication that's associated with articles that sometimes take more than an hour to read is a sort of texture and an energy that is interesting in other formats as well. And so to work with someone as brilliant as Artangel on a really, really, really long event is quite appealing in that respect.
Well, it sounds very interesting. So post-COVID, we're now coming out of lockdown, hopefully. What do you see as the challenges and opportunities for the LRB, and what plans do you have in the pipeline?
So I think that a big thing is just about consolidating the growth. I mean, it's a nice problem to have, but if you've suddenly had 4 years of growth, you've got to think about how this large new potential audience of readers can be sort of kept invested in a publication, even if the world changes. So that's, I think, hugely important. As is, of course, continuing to kind of meet the demands of the moment. There are other kind of dimensions. We have a bookshop, and so that presents huge challenges as a retail space in the kind of era of social distancing. And so there's the question of how you, for example, supplement your on-the-ground business with a digital business of bookselling in order to ensure that the bookshop can continue to do the thing it does amazingly well, which is guide readers to books that they wouldn't have otherwise found, even if they can't do it in person. But the other thing that I'm interested in at the moment is that I think there is a really dangerous kind of moment for culture at this point because of the way that, for example, theatres and concert halls can't, have an audience potentially until the new year, and there's going to be a huge number of creatives who are going to lose their jobs. And I think it's a huge challenge and a massive question for a cultural organisation that has done relatively well in this situation that has the potential to be a real crisis for our kind of colleagues, to think about how we can help, really, and how we can potentially support and work with other cultural organisations and contribute what we're able to contribute in terms of sort of knowledge and an audience, to ensure that this moment in which it sort of feels like both huge parts of culture are in dire straits and that the government potentially actually wants them to fail, that we do everything that we can to kind of act as a bulwark against that kind of anti-Philistinism.
Sure. Well, we've come to the end of the interview. So as our final question, I wanted to ask you, what was the last book you really enjoyed and why?
Well, I spent lockdown in the Kent coast town of Ramsgate, and there's the sort of most famous building in Ramsgate was built by the architect Augustus Pugin, who designed Big Ben and many other churches and Victorian buildings. And so I read my colleague Rosemary Hill's biography of him, and like you do a lot when you read about Victorians, found myself kind of amazed that this kind of guy who I'd always assumed was a sort of fusty and sort of antiquated figure actually had this completely extraordinary life where he had sort of 3 wives and died at the age of 40 despite having produced all this amazing work. And so that was a lockdown discovery that I could read in context.
Sam Kinchin-Smith, thank you very much for being our guest on the In Publishing podcast today.
My pleasure, Ciar. Thanks.
A big thank you again to Acorn Web Offset for sponsoring this podcast. If you're looking for a new magazine printer, then check out their website at acornweb.co.uk or contact Matt Carey on 07714 299 105 or by email at matthew.carey@acornweb.co.uk. Thank you to Sam for being our guest this week. You can find out more about the London Review of Books at lrb.co.uk, and their Twitter handle is @LRB. If you would like to know more about In Publishing, then check out our website, inpublishing.co.uk, where you can also register to receive our magazine and newsletter. We're taking a short break in August, but we'll be back at the beginning of September. Thank you for listening, and please join me in a few weeks' time for our next In Publishing podcast.